Before the gates close, before the steel locks slide into place, there's a moment that feels almost unreal. A stretch of open sky. A final breath of air that doesn't smell like concrete, metal, and disinfectant. According to court records and first-hand reporting, people who enter America's most violent prisons often describe this moment the same way. Not fear yet, but disbelief. The mind refuses to accept what the body already knows. Here is the shocking contradiction that frames this story. The United States calls itself a nation of laws, rights, and due process. Yet within its borders exist institutions so violent, so isolating, that federal courts have repeatedly described them as environments where survival itself becomes uncertain. Places where the rules are written on paper, but power is enforced through silence, hierarchy, and fear. Two of those places stand above the rest in American history: Angola and Attica. According to public records, news investigations, and court filings, these prisons were built to enforce order. Instead, they became symbols of what happens when punishment, politics, and human desperation collide. The story begins in Louisiana, on a piece of land so large it feels unreal. The Louisiana State Penitentiary, known simply as Angola, sits on more than 18,000 acres of former plantation land. According to state archives, the prison takes its name from the African homeland of enslaved people who once worked that soil. Long before it was surrounded by razor wire, the land was surrounded by violence. By the early 20th century, Angola had become one of the most feared prisons in the country. News reports and historical accounts describe a place where forced labor, armed guards, and extreme discipline defined daily life. For decades, Angola was known not just as a prison, but as a sentence in itself. Men sent there often expected never to leave. Hundreds of miles north, in upstate New York, another prison was being built with a very different promise. Attica Correctional Facility opened in the 1930s with a stated goal of reform. According to state documents, it was designed to modernize incarceration, emphasizing structure and rehabilitation. But overcrowding, racial tension, and rigid control quickly turned Attica into a pressure cooker. By the late 1960s, both prisons had gained national reputations, but for different reasons. Angola was feared for its isolation. Surrounded on three sides by the Mississippi River, it functioned almost like an island. According to investigative journalists, escape was nearly impossible. Violence inside rarely reached the outside world. Attica was feared for its volatility. Packed cell blocks, racial segregation, and a rigid chain of command created constant tension. According to federal reports, grievances piled up faster than the system could respond. And then, in September 1971, the pressure at Attica exploded. The Attica uprising remains one of the deadliest prison incidents in American history. According to official investigations and court findings, inmates seized control of parts of the prison after years of unresolved complaints about living conditions, medical care, and racial discrimination. Hostages were taken. Negotiations stalled. When the state retook the prison, 43 people were dead, including inmates and correctional officers. For decades, official narratives blamed prisoners for the deaths. Later investigations revealed that most fatalities were caused by law enforcement gunfire during the retaking of the facility. That revelation alone reshaped how Americans viewed prisons. But Angola, at the same time, was building its own legacy of violence and silence. According to court filings and reporting by national outlets, Angola was notorious for inmate-on-inmate violence throughout the mid-20th century. Understaffing, armed trustees, and racial divisions created conditions where brutality flourished. In some periods, the prison averaged dozens of inmate deaths per year. One former warden would later describe Angola as the bloodiest prison in America, a quote widely cited in news coverage and academic research. The men who entered these prisons were not all the same. Some were convicted of violent crimes. Others were serving long sentences for offenses that would carry far less punishment today. According to public defender records and advocacy groups, many arrived young, unprepared, and unaware of the unspoken rules that govern survival. Inside, power was not simply enforced by guards. It flowed through inmate hierarchies, racial groupings, and informal systems of control. According to testimony collected in court cases, certain housing units developed internal rule structures. Protection, access to work assignments, even safety could depend on alliances. Violence was not constant, but it was always possible, and that possibility shaped everything. In Angola, men worked the fields under armed supervision well into the late 20th century. News photographs showed rows of prisoners harvesting crops on land once worked by enslaved people. Critics argued the symbolism was impossible to ignore. Supporters claimed the work provided structure and reduced violence. At Attica, the control was tighter, more mechanical. Locked cells, scheduled movement, strict enforcement. According to state oversight reports, the lack of flexibility contributed to resentment that simmered for years before erupting. Both prisons became case studies in what happens when institutions prioritize containment over humanity. By the 1980s and 1990s, lawsuits began reshaping the conversation. Federal courts ruled that conditions in some prisons violated constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. Consent decrees forced changes. Oversight increased. Angola underwent significant reforms under new leadership. According to court documents, violence declined, educational programs expanded, and long-term inmates took on mentoring roles. Critics argued reforms came too late. Supporters pointed to measurable improvements. Attica, too, changed. New policies were introduced. Training expanded. But the shadow of 1971 never faded. Every disturbance, every lockdown, every use of force incident was measured against the memory of the uprising. This is where the story becomes uncomfortable. Because despite reforms, despite oversight, both prisons remain among the most feared in the nation. According to recent reporting, Angola still houses thousands of men serving life sentences. Attica continues to experience periodic unrest and allegations of excessive force. The question is not whether these prisons are violent. The question is why. Experts point to a convergence of factors: overcrowding, long sentences, racial disparities, limited mental health care, and a punitive philosophy rooted in decades-old policy decisions. According to criminologists and legal scholars, prisons like Angola and Attica did not become violent overnight. They evolved that way. This is not about sensationalism. It is about understanding how institutions designed to enforce justice became environments where violence felt inevitable, how silence became survival, how control became currency, and how the legacy of these prisons extends far beyond their walls. Because what happens inside Angola and Attica does not stay there. It shapes laws, court rulings, public trust, and the lives of generations. We go inside daily life behind these walls. Not the myths, not the headlines, but the documented routines, tensions, and unspoken rules that determine who is safe, who is vulnerable, and who learns too late how the system truly works. The first thing people misunderstand about maximum security prisons is the idea that violence is constant. According to court filings, investigative journalism, and first-hand accounts, the reality is more unsettling. Most days are quiet, predictable, structured, and that routine is exactly what makes the violence so dangerous when it finally erupts. Inside Angola and Attica, daily life is governed by schedules so rigid they feel mechanical. Wake-up calls arrive at the same hour every morning. Counts happen again and again, sometimes a dozen times a day. According to correctional policies entered into court records, these counts are not about efficiency. They're about control. Every face accounted for. Every body placed exactly where it is expected to be. At Angola, the day often begins before sunrise. News reports describe men lining up under floodlights, boots scraping dirt paths as they move toward work assignments. Field crews still operate on prison farmland, a practice defended by the state as vocational training and criticized by advocacy groups as symbolic and coercive. According to Department of Corrections data, Thousands of inmates work agricultural jobs, earning pennies per hour. Those jobs matter more than outsiders realize. Inside Angola, work assignments can determine survival. Court testimony from past lawsuits reveals that certain jobs offer safer housing, better access to staff, or protection from predatory inmates. Others leave men exposed. According to former inmates interviewed by journalists, refusing work is not simply disobedience. It can mark someone as unstable, difficult, or weak. And weakness is dangerous. Housing units at Angola range from massive dormitories to tightly controlled cell blocks. According to investigative reports, dorm housing can hold dozens of men in a single open space. There are no bars between beds, no privacy, just rows of bunks and the constant awareness of everyone else's presence. In these spaces, informal order emerges. Older inmates, long-timers, and those with reputations often establish authority without official recognition. According to sworn statements and expert testimony, these informal hierarchies regulate behavior. Who sleeps where, who speaks when, who intervenes in disputes. Violence is not random. It is corrective. At Attica, the structure is different, but the tension is just as real. Cells line long tiers stacked, several levels high. Doors slam shut with a sound that echoes down corridors and lingers. According to public oversight reports, the noise itself becomes a form of pressure. Silence never fully arrives. There's always metal clanking somewhere, voices traveling through concrete, radios crackling with coded chatter. Movement at Attica is tightly controlled. When doors open, it is brief and deliberate. Lines form quickly. Any hesitation draws attention. According to correctional experts cited in litigation, moments of transition are the most dangerous. Hallways, stairwells, shower lines, chow halls. This is where confrontations begin, but they rarely start loudly. Most incidents begin with looks, small violations of unspoken boundaries, standing too close, sitting in the wrong place. According to inmate affidavits, race often determines where a person belongs. These divisions are not officially sanctioned, but they are enforced relentlessly by inmates themselves. Correctional officers are aware of these dynamics. According to internal training materials cited in court cases, officers are taught to observe patterns rather than individual acts. Who sits with whom? Who moves together? Who stops talking when staff approach? At Angola, staff numbers historically lag behind population growth. Multiple federal lawsuits cited chronic understaffing as a contributing factor to violence. Fewer officers meant slower responses. Slower responses meant greater reliance on inmate self-regulation. At Attica, staffing levels were higher, but distrust ran deeper. According to testimony from former officers, the legacy of the 1971 uprising shaped everything. Inmates believed force would be used quickly. Officers believed hesitation could be fatal. That mutual suspicion hardened routines. Medical care became another pressure point. Court records show repeated lawsuits alleging delayed treatment, ignored symptoms, and inadequate mental health care at both facilities. According to federal monitors, long wait times for sick call and limited access to psychiatric services contributed to frustration and instability. Mental illness does not disappear behind bars. It intensifies. Men suffering from untreated conditions often struggle to follow prison norms. They speak out of turn. They misread social cues. According to expert witnesses, these individuals are at heightened risk of assault, disciplinary action, or prolonged isolation. Solitary confinement plays a central role in both prisons. At Angola, isolation units house inmates deemed dangerous or disruptive. According to Department of Corrections policy, confinement can last months or years. Advocacy groups argue that prolonged isolation causes psychological harm. The state counters that it is necessary for safety. At Attica, segregation units serve a similar purpose. According to court filings, inmates placed there often experience extreme sensory deprivation. Lights on for long hours. Minimal human contact. Meals slid through slots. Isolation is meant to control violence. But according to multiple studies cited in legal challenges, it can also produce it. Men released from isolation often return angrier, less stable, and more prone to conflict. Officers describe these transitions as volatile. Inmate accounts describe them as terrifying. Food, too, becomes a source of tension. According to investigative journalism, shortages, low-quality meals, and long lines contribute to daily stress. At Attica, grievances about food were among the complaints raised before the 1971 uprising. Decades later, similar complaints appear in oversight reports. Meals are one of the few times large groups gather. They're also one of the few times inmates can see each other across housing units. According to correctional experts, this makes dining halls flashpoints. A tray slammed too hard, a comment overheard, a seat taken without permission. Fights erupt quickly and end faster than outsiders expect. Officers rush in. Commander shouted. Bodies are separated. Someone is injured. Someone is removed. Then silence returns. Paperwork follows. Every incident generates reports. According to public records, these documents are reviewed, filed, and often forgotten. Only when patterns emerge do they attract attention. By then, damage has already been done. For inmates, the lesson is clear. Do not draw attention. Learn the rhythm. Observe before acting. Trust slowly, if at all. According to former inmates interviewed in long-form investigations, survival depends less on strength than awareness. Knowing when to speak, when to move, when to disappear into routine. And routine can be seductive. Men serving long sentences often describe a psychological shift. Days blur together. The outside world feels distant, unreal. According to psychologists who have studied long-term incarceration, institutionalization sets in. The prison becomes normal. Danger becomes background noise. This normalization is what makes maximum security prisons so unsettling. Violence is not constant, but it is always possible. Order exists, but it is fragile. Control is maintained, but at a cost. Angola and Attica function because people adapt. Officers learn to read tension. Inmates learn to avoid it. Administrators balance safety, politics, and public scrutiny. But the system never fully stabilizes. Court filings show cycles repeating again and again. A period of calm, a triggering event, a spike in violence, a crackdown, lawsuits, reform promises, gradual easing. Then the cycle begins again. This is not about the worst moments. It is about the ordinary ones. The days when nothing happens, yet everything feels like it could. The quiet mornings under watchtowers. The echoing corridors. The meals eaten quickly. The looks exchanged and avoided. Because it is within this daily reality that reputations are built. Not through constant chaos, but through the understanding that chaos is never far away. We examine the moments when control fails completely. The incidents that force these prisons into the national spotlight. The investigations, the court battles, and the long shadows they cast over everyone inside. There is a moment in every maximum security prison when the balance tips. It is rarely announced. There is no alarm that signals it in advance. According to investigators and court records, it often begins as something small, almost invisible, buried inside a routine day that looks exactly like every other one. At Angola, that moment has historically arrived during transitions. A housing reassignment. A lockdown lifted too quickly. A rumor spreading faster than staff can confirm it. News reports and sworn testimony describe how tension builds silently, moving through dormitories and cell blocks like electricity through exposed wire. Men sense it before they understand it. Voices lower. Movement slows. Eye contact becomes sharper, more deliberate. According to former inmates interviewed by journalists, this is when people choose sides without saying so. Who they sit near, who they avoid, who they prepare to defend, and who they prepare to abandon. At Attica, the warning signs are different, but just as unmistakable. Officers become more rigid. Counts take longer. Units are held back without explanation. According to internal memos disclosed in litigation, these measures are often preventative, based on intelligence gathered from informants or intercepted communication. But intelligence is never complete. In both prisons, violence does not erupt because control disappears. It erupts because control tightens unevenly. At Angola, one of the most documented triggers has been housing pressure. According to court filings, overcrowding in dormitory units increases friction exponentially. Men who normally avoid each other are forced into proximity. Old disputes resurface. New ones form quickly. In one widely reported incident cited in investigative journalism, a minor argument over personal space escalated within minutes. Witnesses described a sudden surge of bodies, shouts swallowed by noise, and officers arriving to find multiple inmates injured. The official reports labeled it an altercation. Inmate affidavits described it as inevitable. At Attica, escalation has often been tied to perceived injustice. According to historical records and modern oversight reports, lockdowns imposed without explanation fuel resentment. Men confined to cells for days begin to believe they are being punished collectively for something they did not do. That belief is dangerous. Court testimony from correctional experts explains why. Collective punishment erodes compliance. It turns frustration into solidarity. Solidarity, under the wrong conditions, becomes resistance. This is the pattern that defined Attica in 1971, according to state archives and congressional investigations. It is also the pattern officials have tried to prevent ever since. Yet echoes remain. Modern incidents at Attica, documented in news reports, show similar dynamics on smaller scales. A fight in one unit leads to facility-wide lockdown. Programs are canceled. Visits are suspended. Tension spreads beyond those involved. Inside Angola, isolation units become crowded after violent incidents. According to Department of Corrections data, inmates deemed threats are moved quickly, sometimes based on limited information. These decisions are later challenged in court, where attorneys argue that misclassification places nonviolent inmates in extreme conditions. Isolation does not calm everyone. Psychological evaluations submitted as evidence in multiple lawsuits describe heightened anxiety, paranoia, and aggression following prolonged segregation. Men released back into general population often return changed. Less patient, less trusting, more volatile. Officers feel it too. According to union statements and sworn testimony, staff shortages mean officers are often working extended shifts during crises. Fatigue sets in. Reaction times slow. Judgment suffers. This is where breakdowns occur. In one case, detailed in federal court filings, delayed response times during a disturbance were linked to insufficient staffing. By the time backup arrived, injuries had already occurred. The state argued resources were limited. Plaintiffs argued lives were lost. Both arguments appear repeatedly in the record. When violence spills beyond control, administration responds with forceful containment. Tactical teams deploy. Entire units are locked down. Searches intensify. According to internal reports later released, these measures are designed to reassert authority quickly, but they come with consequences. Inmates describe lockdowns as suffocating. Days stretch into weeks. Programs vanish. Contact with family stops. According to psychologists cited in oversight hearings, prolonged lockdowns increase depression and hopelessness. At Angola, some lockdowns have lasted months. At Attica, weeks. Each extension deepens resentment. Media attention often follows. Journalists request records. Advocacy groups demand investigations. Politicians issue statements. According to public archives, these moments generate reform promises that rarely survive long-term scrutiny. After the cameras leave, routines resume. The deeper truth revealed by decades of documentation is this: violence in maximum security prisons is not an aberration. It is a structural risk built into environments where power, scarcity, and fear intersect. Angola's vast size makes oversight difficult. Attica's history makes trust fragile. Both operate under public pressure to appear secure, while absorbing population society has deemed too dangerous to manage elsewhere. That contradiction cannot be fully resolved. Every violent incident leaves a paper trail. Reports are written, reviews conducted. Sometimes reforms follow. More often, systems adapt just enough to continue functioning. And inside, the people adapt too. Men learn where to stand during counts, which officers to avoid, when silence is safer than speech. According to sociological studies cited in court cases, these adaptations become survival strategies passed from inmate to inmate. This is how reputations are reinforced, not through isolated explosions, but through the constant understanding that the system can fracture at any moment. That order exists, but only conditionally. By the end of each crisis, Angola and Attica appear unchanged to outsiders. Gates still open. Counts still happen. Work details resume. But inside, memory lingers. Men remember who intervened and who watched. Officers remember who hesitated and who didn't. Administrators remember which names appeared in reports. These memories shape the next confrontation long before it occurs. The violence does not need to be frequent to be powerful. Its possibility is enough. In the final chapter, we confront what remains after the headlines fade. The legal aftermath, the reforms that stall, the legacy these prisons carry into the present, and the question that still hangs over them. Can institutions built on containment ever truly escape the cycles that define them? When the violence subsides, when the lockdowns lift and the units reopen, Angola and Attica do not return to normal. According to court records, investigative reporting, and oversight reviews, they return to something quieter, heavier, and more permanent: legacy. The aftermath of violence in a maximum security prison is rarely dramatic. There are no public ceremonies, no clear endings. Instead, there are files, depositions, settlement agreements, internal reviews stamped confidential, lives altered in ways that do not fit neatly into statistics. At Angola, the fallout is often unfolded through the courts. Federal lawsuits filed over the past several decades describe patterns rather than isolated events. Excessive force claims, failure to protect allegations, challenges to prolonged solitary confinement. Judges reviewing these cases have repeatedly acknowledged the complexity of managing a prison of Angola's size and population, while also noting that constitutional limits do not disappear behind razor wire. In several rulings, courts emphasized a central tension. Angola is expected to house some of the most dangerous offenders in the country, yet must do so without violating the Eighth Amendment's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. That line, judges have written, is difficult to define, but impossible to ignore. Settlements followed many of these cases. According to state financial disclosures, Louisiana has paid millions of dollars over time to resolve civil rights claims connected to Angola. Each settlement avoided an admission of wrongdoing. Each added another layer to the prison's paper trail. At Attica, the legacy is inseparable from history. The 1971 uprising permanently changed how the prison is viewed, not just by the public, but by lawmakers, corrections officials, and the courts. According to congressional investigations and state archives, Attica became a reference point in national debates about prison reform, inmate rights, and the use of force. In the decades that followed, New York implemented reforms directly linked to the lessons of Attica. Oversight mechanisms expanded. Grievance procedures were formalized. Training requirements increased. Yet, according to more recent watchdog reports, problems persisted. Attica continued to experience violent incidents, staff assaults, and prolonged lockdowns well into the modern era. Each time, the same questions resurfaced. Were the reforms real or cosmetic? Was the culture changing or merely adapting? The answers remain disputed. What is clear from public records is that both prisons now operate under a level of scrutiny that did not exist in earlier decades. Federal monitors, independent investigators, and advocacy organizations track conditions closely. Incidents that once stayed internal now reach journalists within days. Transparency has improved, but not trust. Correctional officers interviewed anonymously by reporters often describe feeling caught in the middle. They're tasked with maintaining control in environments defined by volatility, while also navigating increased oversight and public criticism. Union statements emphasize understaffing, burnout, and rising mental health challenges among staff. Inmates describe a different cost. According to sworn affidavits and interviews conducted by civil rights groups, long-term incarceration in facilities like Angola and Attica reshapes identity. Men learn to suppress emotion, to read danger in silence, to expect disappointment. Hope becomes conditional, something managed carefully to avoid collapse. For those who eventually leave, the effects linger. Psychological studies cited in court proceedings document high rates of post-traumatic stress symptoms among formerly incarcerated individuals from high-security prisons. Hypervigilance, difficulty with trust, trouble adapting to unstructured environments. These outcomes are not universal, but they're common enough to be considered systemic. Families carry their own burden. Parents, spouses, and children describe years spent navigating visitation rules, lockdown cancellations, and limited communication. According to advocacy reports, prolonged lockdowns sever family contact at moments when it is most needed. Relationships strain, sometimes beyond repair. These costs rarely appear in official metrics. Politically, both Angola and Attica occupy uncomfortable ground. Closing them is rarely discussed seriously. Too many jobs depend on them. Too much infrastructure has been built around them. Local economies, especially in rural areas, are deeply tied to prison employment. Reform, therefore, becomes incremental. At Angola, programs emphasizing work, faith-based initiatives, and limited educational opportunities have been highlighted by administrators as evidence of progress. Critics counter that these programs exist alongside some of the most restrictive confinement practices in the country. At Attica, educational and rehabilitative efforts have expanded over time, earning praise from some observers. Yet, according to oversight reports, these programs are often suspended during lockdowns, precisely when they might matter most. The cycle repeats. A crisis occurs. Attention spikes. Promises are made. Adjustments follow. Then attention fades. What remains is institutional memory. Angola remembers its reputation as a place people enter and rarely leave. Attica remembers a moment when control was lost and never fully regained. These memories shape policy decisions, staff behavior, and inmate expectations long after the events themselves have passed. Experts in corrections theory argue that legacy can be as powerful as policy. When a prison is known for violence, both staff and inmates behave differently from the moment they arrive. Anticipation of danger becomes a self-fulfilling force. This is not unique to Angola or Attica, but these institutions have become symbols of it. In recent years, broader criminal justice reform movements have forced renewed scrutiny. Solitary confinement limits, sentencing reform, and decarceration efforts have all intersected with discussions about maximum security prisons. According to legislative testimony, Angola and Attica are frequently cited as examples of what happens when incarceration becomes an endpoint rather than a process. Yet change is slow. The law moves deliberately. Institutions move even slower. For every reform proposal, there is a counterargument grounded in security. For every lawsuit, there is a concern about unintended consequences. The balance between safety and humanity remains unresolved. And perhaps that is the most enduring legacy. Angola and Attica are not aberrations. They are mirrors. They reflect a system that demands absolute control over those it fears most, while simultaneously insisting that control remain humane, constitutional, and invisible to the public. The contradiction is never fully reconciled. As long as these prisons exist, they will continue to generate stories. Some documented in court filings, some whispered in housing units, some carried silently by those who leave. When the gates close each night, the world outside rarely notices. But inside, time stretches, memories harden, and the legacy deepens. The final truth revealed by decades of evidence is not that Angola and Attica are uniquely violent. It is that they reveal what happens when punishment is asked to do more than it can bear. They contain danger, but they also contain history. And history, once written into concrete and steel, is difficult to erase.